Hi, this is Clayton Cahan Lust, and we are uh, going to be talking about Reconstruction in this video. And I'm recording this and putting it off separately from my History 1301 and my History 1302 classes, kind of as a little bit of a refresher for my 1302 classes. If you've been in a 1301 class with me, we should have gotten through this particular era. But if you were with some other professor, or you were with me in some weird semester that we lost a couple of days, and for whatever reason we didn't get to this stuff, this would be where you could watch it and pick up what you need to kind of give you the full breadth of knowledge, so that when we start History 1302, you're ready to go, and you don't have to kind of have a learning curve about what the issues are and what the problems are heading into the so-called Reconstruction era. So without further ado, let's get right to Reconstruction. Let's see what happens with Reconstruction. The central issue in the Reconstruction era is going to be what do we do with the former slaves, and what is the status of the former slaves. Now we're going to call these former slaves freedmen. There's one phrase that I absolutely hate in American history and in American history classes, and that's when people say, quote unquote, freed slaves. So we're going to use the term freedmen. Now, the Civil War is absolutely revolutionary for the people of the 19th century. This Civil War was the great trauma for those people, and it's absolutely a moment of revolutionary change in the United States. It transformed everyday American lives. It transformed the lives of the freedmen. It transformed virtually everything. First and foremost, the Civil War freed almost 4 million enslaved people from bondage in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation had, quote unquote, freed enslaved people in Confederate controlled territory, but it didn't free anybody in American-controlled territory, and a lot of Southerners didn't buy that the United States had the authority to free those enslaved anyway. So the bulk of the enslaved people in this country are freed by the conclusion of the American Civil War. The Civil War also represented a massive demographic crisis for the American South. The Civil War ended up killing approximately 1/4 of the South's adult male population. At least on paper, anyway, the end of the Civil War meant former slaves achieving civil and political rights within the United States. Now, we're not talking about to what extent Americans lived up to those civil rights or enforced those civil rights, respected, whatever phrase you want to use. We're just talking about at the moment, or in the moment, former slaves are going to achieve political and civil rights in this country. It's also going to lead to a massive military occupation of the American South. Now, a lot of people think that occupation begins right after the Civil War, but it doesn't. It actually comes a little bit after the Civil War. But we're going to see a number of regional governors across the South, and all of those regional governors are going to be Northerners. So virtually all of the states in the South, the former Confederacy, are going to be governed by Northerners. Now, the central issue for the next 12 years, 1865 to 1877, is going to be, what is the status of the freedmen? What is their life going to actually be like? And the reason people were asking this is that the Civil War may have, quote, freed all of these people, but what it did not do is create a clear status. It didn't create clear legal equality for the freedmen either. And at least in the early days after the Civil War was over, it looked like nothing was going to change for African Americans. There would be no real difference. The war was over, and virtually every Southern state passed a series of laws that were referred to as black codes. Now, the black codes were not the same in every single state. Sometimes they were affected by local ordinance rather than state ordinance. But the point is that they drew the inspiration for these black codes from the so-called slave codes of the pre-Civil War era. So everything that was being done here was about restricting the movement and restricting the freedom of African Americans. These codes variously accomplished the following things. They required written proof of employment for freedmen. They called on African Americans to sign employment contracts that would require them to work from sun up to sundown. They wound up working on the same plantations that they had worked on as enslaved people in many cases. Some areas made it a crime for African Americans to leave the plantations that they had been on. Various laws also made it a crime for African Americans to own weapons, to own property, to in any way really engage in citizenship in the United States. This was a real jolt to a lot of people. One African American, a former slave, said, quote, "If you call this freedom, what exactly did you call slavery?" Northerners were not happy about these black codes in any way, shape, or form. They were not buying any of this stuff. They were looking at this and saying, why did 620,000 people die in this Civil War? If the end result is going to be quote unquote black codes, what was all of the dying and sacrificing over? Because we didn't do it for this. We didn't do it for this sort of minimal change. So a battle breaks out over what Reconstruction is actually going to mean, what it's going to mean for the former slaves, what it's going to mean for the nation, what it's going to mean for the individual states. Now, a crucial blow to the prospects for Reconstruction had actually been struck on April 15th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln, his assassination at the hands of John Wilkes Booth while he was attending a play in Washington, D.C., ended what was going to be Lincoln's control over Reconstruction. Now, Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, had said that he intended to pursue Reconstruction with, quote, malice toward none, with charity for all. Now, given that he had said that, it doesn't or it shouldn't surprise that his Reconstruction plan was actually a mild Reconstruction plan. He was going to offer pardons to all Confederates who took an oath of allegiance to the United States. And as far as reconstructing the individual states goes, he said as soon as 10% of eligible voters from 1860 took that oath of allegiance and the state wrote a new constitution that would abolish slavery, then that's it. The state is reconstructed. They're brought back into the Union as if nothing had happened. Okay, as full members, fully participating, fully voting in the House and the Senate, basically like they had never left. Now, some Northerners didn't like this plan. They did not believe that it was punitive enough, that there had been way too much killing and way too much dying, and the South had to be punished. And their ideas were embodied in the counterproposal that Congress came up with. Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis came up with a counterproposal called the Wade-Davis Bill. And the fundamental difference here was that 50% had to agree to swear the oath of allegiance to the United States, as opposed to 10%. The states would still have to write a new state constitution that would forbid slavery as a condition for admission. But the big change is the 50% part of this. Now, Lincoln did not sign this bill. It passed the House, it passed the Senate, made it to Lincoln's desk. But what Lincoln did was Lincoln engaged in a pocket veto. A pocket veto is when the president just simply lets the congressional session end without signing legislation. That effectively kills the legislation. So Lincoln didn't veto it, but he just didn't sign it either. So Congress, when they meet again, they're going to have to take this whole process up again. And Lincoln is hoping that in the meantime, he can convince them to see it more his way than the sort of 50% way. That's why I say that Lincoln's assassination kind of messed this whole plan up. Now, Lincoln is no longer president of the United States, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes the president of the United States. Now, Johnson was a sort of typical Lincoln appointee. He was a Democrat, and Lincoln had put him on the ticket in 1864 to demonstrate unity. What better way to show union in this country than to say, we're going to have the Republican Party, which is dominated by Northerners, to bring this union together. Our vice presidential candidate will be a Southern Democrat, a guy like Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. So Johnson is the vice president now, and he's in charge of Reconstruction, a Southern Democrat in charge of Reconstruction. And a lot of Northerners were very wary of all of this. They were very wary of how this was going to play out. Now, Johnson had been illiterate into adulthood, and he absolutely detested the wealthy. But as optimistic as Republicans were about things like that he detested the wealthy, that he detested the planter class, Johnson was also incredibly flawed. Like many people of that era, he was incredibly racist, but he was also prone to flattery. So Southern elites knew exactly how to ingratiate themselves with the new president and how to get what they wanted. And the first battle that breaks out over Reconstruction demonstrates this, how Southerners used Andrew Johnson to get what they wanted. Congress created an agency called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, I don't care what website you go to. I don't care whose blog you read or anything like that. The Freedmen's Bureau, regardless of whether it says in the official title of the Freedmen's Bureau that it's about refugees, all of the refugees covered under the Freedmen's Bureau Act are freedmen. So only freedmen benefited from Freedmen's Bureau Act activities. Okay. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be the first national government effort at any sort of social welfare program. The Bureau would provide food, it would provide shelter, it would create schools, it would help reunite separated families that had been separated over the course of slavery. One of its more important functions as a federal body was that it would adjudicate contract disputes between landowners and the now former slaves who were working their land as free laborers now. And in a lot of cases, the Freedmen's Bureau ruled in favor of the freedmen, saying that the labor contracts that they were signing were not fair to them, so that the contract had to be rewritten. When this bill gets created in the Congress, it had overwhelming support. Lincoln had indicated that if Congress passed it, he would sign it. So with that in mind, Congress passed this thinking that surely Lincoln's vice president would also sign the Freedmen's Bureau Act. However, Southerners, the planter class in the South, told Johnson, we don't like this bill. We don't want anything that helps the freedmen. We want you to veto this. And Johnson essentially, I'm not going to say he did as he was told, because there was no, do this or else. But they kind of, lobbied him, and their lobbying was successful. Johnson vetoed it. However, as I mentioned, this had really broad support. So Congress overrode the veto, and they overrode it fairly easily. So the Freedmen's Bureau is not just about this first government effort at a social welfare program. It also is sort of the opening salvo, if you will, in this fight between Congress and the president over who's in charge of Reconstruction. And at least in this first battle, Congress won. Congress won the battle. Now, the next part is the issue of land. And I'm sure some of you have heard the quote unquote myth, if you will, of 40 acres and a mule. If we were in class in person, I'd be asking you all if you've heard the myth of 40 acres and a mule, raise your hand. And I suspect most of you would raise your hand here. But for a lot of people, they've been told that, well, that was all a myth. There was no such thing as 40 acres and a mule. And the answer in reality is, kind of. There was no provision for, quote, 40 acres and a mule. However, following the American Civil War, Northern generals started giving away land that had been owned by former Confederates. There were a number of Southerners who were plantation owners who, toward the end of the Civil War, were simply abandoning their land. They took off. They abandoned homes. They abandoned crops. And all of this land wound up being controlled by the United States Army. The United States Army would come into an area. They'd seize all of this land. And the Army doesn't want to be in the business of owning land. So guys like William Tecumseh Sherman, in specific when it comes to Field Order 15, issued an order. Field Order 15 wound up giving African Americans access to land. What Field Order 15 did was it gave African Americans up to 80 acres of land, 40 acres of land and 80 feet of shoreline property if they were in an area bounded by water. And the mule part of this myth was that under Field Order 15, African Americans could lease a team of mules to plow their fields at a reduced rate from the United States Army. Now, this is important because it gives access to land ownership to the former slaves. Field Order 15 also says that the land will be under the political control of the freedmen in the area. So it is sort of a deprivation of property, if you will. It does actually take property that had been previously owned by Southern planters. When they abandoned it, the United States Army seizes it by right of conquest and then redistributed it to the former slaves. Now, obviously, landowners, the former plantation owners, were very unhappy about this. And they claimed that it violated the Constitution. It violated the idea of taking away property without due process of law. And once again, they lobbied Andrew Johnson to get rid of Field Order 15. And Andrew Johnson did precisely that. Executive Order 93 repealed Field Order 15. Johnson issued a subsequent field order that ordered everybody in the area to settle the problem in a manner, satisfactory to all parties. But the big takeaway from it is that it takes all of that land that had been given to former slaves under Field Order 15, it takes it all away and restores it to the original property owners. The next issue in terms of a split, again, between Congress and the president is over the issue of violence against African Americans. And here the crucial place is actually Texas. About 3,000 former slaves were murdered in Texas following the Civil War, following the announcement of the end of the Civil War. A lot of Southerners a lot of congressmen were demanding that Johnson do something, that he send military forces into Texas to end this crisis, to end these murders. And Johnson steadfastly refused to do anything about it. Johnson essentially said that the issue was a matter for local law enforcement. It was a state-oriented issue. So the federal government had no business in this and said, we're not doing it. The state of Texas is capable of handling this on their own. So we, quote unquote, the federal government, is not intervening. Now, this made a lot of people in the North very angry over how Reconstruction is proceeding. Again, they don't see much of a change. They look at this and they say that the South is still essentially in control. They're still kind of bullying the North. Even though they've lost the Civil War, they're still kind of pushing the North around and saying, we want it our way. And the North is saying, but we defeated you, so we're not letting you have, quote, your way. So the next crucial blow is going to happen in 1866. In the election of 1866, a group of Republicans who had dubbed themselves radical Republicans swept those midterm elections. They were now in control of the Republican Party, and they also swept the elections to the point that the radical Republicans controlled 2/3 of both the House and the United States Senate. Now, why I mentioned that they have control of 2/3 of both the House and the Senate is this means they are a veto-proof majority, meaning they can pass any piece of legislation that they want. And if Andrew Johnson vetoes that piece of legislation, the House and the Senate can, in joint session, override the veto. And they've got the votes to do it. They've easily got the votes to do it. So this inaugurates a period that is known as, quote, radical Reconstruction, because it's presided over by this radical Congress. Now, it's not really terribly radical in terms of what they want. The radicalism is that they believe that Congress should be in charge of the Reconstruction process, and they are going to wield that power like a hammer. The first thing that they do under radical Reconstruction is they're going to divide the South into 5 military districts. You can see them on the screen here. They're going to divide the South into 5 military districts, and they're going to send the Army in to preside over each one of these military districts to protect African American civil rights. This is what's called bayonet rule. So the South is in reality, they are occupied by Northern forces, by Union forces, and this is a year after the Civil War is over that these Union forces are coming in and saying it's going to be our way. We are the ones in charge here. Now, that's the first part of it. They divide the South into these 5 military districts. Congress also passes and sends out to the states for ratification 2 important constitutional amendments. These 2 amendments are the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Now, before I get to the 14th and 15th Amendment, I want to mention here that Congress had already passed, sent out for ratification, and it had already been ratified a 13th Amendment. Okay. Now, why a 13th Amendment was necessary? The 13th Amendment, by the way, ends the institution of slavery. But why that 13th Amendment was necessary was, if you've already taken 1301, you should know that the Dred Scott case declared that African Americans, free or enslaved, can never, ever be citizens of the United States, that they just don't possess certain constitutional rights, that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, none of this stuff, quote, applies to African Americans. So the 13th was considered an absolute necessity right off the bat at the end of the Civil War. And it ends slavery except for punishment of crimes where the party has been, quote, duly convicted. That's an important loophole, one that we'll come back to later. But the 14th and the 15th Amendment are really important. The 13th ends slavery, but the 14th addresses this issue of citizenship in the United States. Since the Dred Scott case said none of this stuff applied to African Americans, this is fixed with the 14th Amendment. It says, quote, anyone born, and I'm paraphrasing here, anyone born in the United States is a citizen, and it's got a section in it called the Equal Protection Clause that says that the rights of citizenship apply equally to all. So anyone born in the United States is a citizen. That means all of the freedmen are now citizens, just like that, and that the rights of citizenship apply equally to all. Now, there is a little bit of a problem in all of this stuff. The problem for Northerners is that the Constitution had been created with a compromise called the 3/5 Compromise. This way back in the 1780s. The 3/5 Compromise said that slave states could count 3/5 of their slave population toward their total population for purposes of apportioning congressional members and for the Electoral College and for the apportionment of taxes. Now, what this meant is that African Americans now count 100% by ending slavery, and now they're citizens. This effectively repeals the 3/5 Compromise, and African Americans can actually count 100%. So the South actually winds up gaining membership in the House of Representatives, or at least theoretically gaining membership in the House of Representatives. They've got a whole bunch of new members when they reapportion congressional membership. But the 14th Amendment is strange. The 14th Amendment says that the rights of citizenship apply equally to all. But what it does not specifically state is that all citizens have the right to vote. In a very important Supreme Court case or appellate court case that was presided over by a Supreme Court justice, women in the state of New Jersey had attempted to register to vote and had been denied that attempt to register. And when they argued that the 14th Amendment applied here, the presiding judge said, well, yes, the 14th Amendment does say that the rights of citizenship do apply equally to all. And if the state says that you are qualified to vote, then yeah, you're qualified to vote. But that was an important caveat. Since the state determines who the electorate actually is, the state can say, a state like New Jersey can say, well, yeah, all citizens except women. Women don't get to vote. Women can't do that. Okay. So since it's up to the states who can and can't vote, the 14th Amendment doesn't actually give the former slaves the right to vote. So many congressmen argued that a 15th Amendment was actually necessary. And that 15th Amendment stated that the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this wipes away the ability of the individual states to say, well, we're going to say that enslaved people can't vote, or that Black people generally can't vote. Because if they do, they're violating the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So this is really important stuff, and it does actually change the structure of elections in the United States. So now, Reconstruction is proceeding. It's proceeding under congressional control now, not the control of the President of the United States. And now Andrew Johnson has decided it's time to take a stand. Enough is enough. He has virtually no power. He's kind of, I'm not going to say he's a figurehead because he's not, but he doesn't really have the power to stop Congress from doing anything. And he's not happy here. Now, the last showdown between Congress and the president is going to be a law called the Tenure of Office Act. Congress passes this law because Johnson, in trying to send a message to Congress, tell them, look, I don't care who you are. I don't care whether you're radical Republicans or what. I am still in charge of the executive branch. One of the radicals, if you will, was the Secretary of War, a guy named Edwin Stanton. He fully bought into the radical agenda. And Johnson felt, well, as long as Edwin Stanton is part of the executive branch, the radicals will feel emboldened. So I've got to get rid of Stanton. And Johnson wasn't exactly secretive that he wanted to get rid of Stanton. He asked for Stanton's resignation and basically said, well, if you don't give me your resignation, I'm going to fire you. And Stanton told him, I'm not resigning, period. In the meantime, Congress passed this act called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act very simply required the president to get congressional approval to remove an appointee who was put into their office with congressional consent to begin with. So a cabinet member, for example, had to be confirmed by Congress. Thus, under the Tenure of Office Act, a cabinet member could only be removed with Congress's consent. This is aimed at stopping Johnson from firing Edwin Stanton. Period. Plain and simple, easy to figure out. Johnson says, I don't care. I don't want Stanton here. And he fires him. Now, because he has fired him, the House of Representatives and senators start complaining and arguing that Andrew Johnson has violated the law. By firing Stanton, he has violated the Tenure of Office Act and thus is subject to impeachment. Now, before we get to the impeachment part, Think about how disastrous this is. Could be. Andrew Johnson is president of the United States. The Constitution says that the president has the authority to choose his or her advisors, that those advisors serve at the pleasure of the president. Every president has this power and has this privilege, if you will. Think about what it would mean in a modern sense. This was being recorded in 2022, this lecture is. And you have all lived through the recent past of some pretty tribalistic types of politics in this country. I don't care which party you are in favor of. I don't care what president you support. But think about for a moment in 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency. Think about the chaos that would have ensued if Trump had to wait to bring in his own cabinet, if he had to wait for Congress to, quote, remove each one of President Obama's cabinet members. And similarly, think about in 2021 when Joe Biden took the oath of office, if before he started doing anything, he had to deal with having to go through a congressional process to remove all of Trump's cabinet before he could do anything. So this is a clearly, well, I shouldn't say it's seemingly unconstitutional on its face, but it's there. And Johnson hates it. Now, as far as the impeachment, the House impeaches him just like that. And as you should be very well aware of, because we've just had a couple of them here in our recent past. The impeachment part is actually easy. The impeachment is kind of like a grand jury proceeding. All they're asking is there enough evidence to suggest that a crime may have been or probably was committed? That's all the impeachment is. It is not the removal part. The impeachment is like an indictment. It says, we believe that there's enough evidence to proceed. And Congress clearly believed that there was enough evidence to proceed on Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson is impeached like that. Now it goes for removal. The removal vote is in the Senate. The trial is in the Senate. It's typically presided over by the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And the Senate looked at this fight between Johnson and the congressional radical Republicans. And as much as it pained them, first of all, the Senate always believed in itself as being a much more serious deliberative body than the House of Representatives was. And they looked at this and said, as much as it pains us to say this, we think Johnson's actually right in his understanding of the Constitution. We don't like Johnson. We don't like that he's trying to remove Edwin Stanton, but we can't deny that the privilege of the chief executive of this country is to choose their own cabinet. And if we remove Johnson over this, we're setting a dangerous precedent. So they vote to acquit. The Senate votes to acquit Johnson. Now, by the narrowest of margins, I want to make that clear. They don't overwhelmingly support this. Johnson is acquitted by one vote. So this could have gone a much different direction. But the fight, so to speak, is over. Johnson has kind of won, if you will. He's been acquitted, but he also knows how very close he came to being removed. Now, this is happening in 1867. In 1868, Andrew Johnson doesn't even bother to run for a term in his own right, so he is gone. The president of the United States that gets elected in the 1868 election is the incredibly popular general from the United States during the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, and he is now fully in charge of the United States. Now, by 1872, abolitionists in this country had realized virtually all of their agenda, at least on paper they had. They had achieved the emancipation of all slaves in the United States. They had achieved, again, on paper anyway, they had achieved the civil rights of all African Americans, all of the freedmen. So they kind of looked at this and said, we don't really have much to fight about at this point. And by this point, the United States itself was looking at the South and saying, we don't really have the energy here to keep fighting over governors and over who's in charge of what in the South. The South began voting in a tremendous amount of racially unfair politicians. They started putting in repressive laws when it comes to civil rights, and Congress just wasn't willing to fight. They looked at this and said, look, we've got to turn this over. We've got to turn control over to the South at some point, and now is as good a time as any. So they basically say, we're not willing to fight over this anymore. On top of all of that, they're starting to turn their attention to the American West. They say, we've got to figure out how we're going to actually get the West settled, how we're going to deal with an impending crisis over Native Americans. So we're done. We're done with all of this stuff. We're thinking about maybe ending the entire process of bayonet rule. We just don't have the energy for this. So they're willing to kind of turn away from Reconstruction. But what puts the nail in the coffin for Reconstruction is a disputed presidential election in 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes, the guy on the bottom of the screen, the governor of Ohio, is going to run for president against the governor of New York, a guy named Samuel J. Tilden. And as you can see on the screen, I'm not going to test you on these types of numbers because the numbers are actually trivial, but I've got them up here just to give you the information. In this election, Samuel J. Tilden wins both the popular vote and he wins the electoral vote. At least on paper, Tilden has won the election. The popular vote is counted very quickly, as you should be very well acquainted with. The electoral vote doesn't really actually get tabulated until later in December following an election, and then it doesn't get certified until January of the following year. So seemingly, anyway, Samuel J. Tilden has won the presidency of the United States. Now, this is important. Tilden is the first Democrat to win the presidency since 1856. So this is a big deal, okay? Now, the way the Republicans play this out, though, they are going to argue that there had been widespread voter fraud in South Carolina, in Louisiana, Oregon, and in Florida. They're going to argue that there were all sorts of electioneering and false ballots and fake ballots that had been cast. And they said, we are challenging the results in these 4 states. Now, there is nothing in the Constitution to resolve this circumstance. If one of the, candidates challenges the results and says, I don't believe it's a legitimate result, there's nothing in the Constitution to prepare them for this, to prepare people to deal with this. The Constitution did have a provision if nobody won the election via a majority in the Electoral College, but not for this stuff. So what Congress does is they look at it and say, well, the Constitution does say that the House of Representatives would determine who the president is in the case of a lack of a majority, and the Senate would determine who the vice president is. So maybe we just look at this and say that the founders had the idea that Congress would resolve electoral disputes. So Congress will appoint a committee to resolve all of this. Now, they're going to take 5 people from the House, 5 people from the Senate, and 5 people from the Supreme Court. And the way they're going to break this congressional committee down is there will be 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. And since there did just happen to be an independent sitting on the Supreme Court, that independent was going to get chosen for this committee to make sure that this doesn't fall down strictly on party lines and we elect a president on the basis of party line. Great idea in theory. However, the Democrats had this idea that we're going to sway this guy's votes. The Democrats came to him and told him, look, we want you to be the senator from Illinois. This justice was from the state of Illinois. The Senate, being a senator, was a pretty good job. It was itself, in and of itself, practically a lifetime appointment during this era. So when they come and offer him the Senate position from Illinois, he takes it. He runs. He says, yeah, I'll take it. I'll gladly take it. He gets out of the Supreme Court, becomes a senator. But just as importantly, this independent also now says, well, I can't really, in good faith, continue to serve on this committee. So he doesn't. So the committee breaks down now 7-7. And the only remaining person they can put on the committee, the only remaining members of the court are Republicans. So ultimately, Congress puts another Republican on this committee, and it breaks down 8-7. So when this committee investigates the votes, investigates the allegations of fraud and all of that sort of stuff, they find in favor of the Republicans, and they give all of the electoral votes from South Carolina, Louisiana, Oregon, and Florida to the Republican Party. That switches the election to Hayes's favor. It moving all of those votes over to Hayes's side, gives him the presidential election. And now everybody in the United States is furious. Democrats are angry because they feel the election has just been stolen from them. Republicans aren't happy because their argument was all along that there had been voter fraud. So all we did was just take back what was ours. A lot of Americans, a lot of average everyday Americans looked at this and said, well, the results don't seem to be in line with what we voted for, so we're not happy. And civil war seemed imminent once again. And think about that. We're in 1877 now, and we're 12 years out from from the American Civil War. And it's now seemingly just about to start up again. Massachusetts and Virginia both mobilized their militias just in case there was going to be a fight. And just as quickly, the problem got resolved. In January of 1877, leaders from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party got together, and they looked at this and said, this is not good for anybody. Nobody benefits from us going back and fighting a civil war. So let's see where we can meet in the middle. Let's see what common ground we can find. And let's see if we can't find a resolution to this. And the resolution winds up being known as the Compromise of 1877. What happens in the Compromise of 1877 is Congress agrees to certify the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as President of the United States. But in return for that certification, Hayes must appoint a Democrat to his cabinet. Essentially, the Democrats are quite literally saying, we want somebody there who's looking out for our interests in your cabinet. So you've got to appoint a Democrat to your cabinet. Hayes would also have to agree to support federal aid for railroad reconstruction in the South. The Union forces had torn up railroads. They had destroyed infrastructure across the South. So the Southern states were saying, look, we want to rebuild all of this, but we're not going to pay for it ourselves. You guys did it. You should pay for it. So Hayes says, they tell Hayes, you want to be the president? They tell the Republicans, you want to maintain the presidency? The cost is supporting aid for railroad reconstruction across the South. And the Republicans say, fine, done. The last point, and I think the most important point out of all of these is that Hayes also has to agree to remove all of the federal troops. He has to dissolve those military districts that I talked about a few minutes back, dissolve those military districts, remove the generals who are functioning as military governors, and then remove all of the troops who were there safeguarding the rights of African Americans. Essentially, they're removing the military rule part of Reconstruction. All of these soldiers are going to be removed from the South. Now, this signified a really important shift in the United States. The historical significance here of the Compromise of 1877, is that the parties are basically agreeing that Southerners are going to handle racial affairs without interference from the North. And the North is going to get control over the nation's economy without interference from the South. This is, there's no stated agreement to this, but it's kind of an understood quid pro quo that the North is going to dominate economic life. The South is going to lead the way in terms of racial issues in this country. This is going to create a very strange political coalition in the United States. Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans, who very often are going to vote in a block all the way into the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, in his first term in office, did not have an actual quote unquote majority in the Senate in the United States. But he was able to get virtually all of his agenda passed in that first term in office because a lot of Southern Democrats would vote right alongside with Northern Republicans. Those Northern Republicans would give Reagan pretty much what he wanted. So this coalition is going to be kind of a solid coalition. Of course, there are going to be exceptions where Republicans and Democrats are going to split over certain key issues. And especially by the time we get to the Great Depression era, we're going to start to see this coalition splitting apart. But for a good part of that period up until the 1980s, Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans generally see a lot of things in the exact same way. All right, that's where we are going to stop this particular lecture. The first lecture is going to be about the 1870s and sort of parallels between that era and the modern era. So I would recommend watching this, but again, this is sort of, it's not required. I'm not going to ask you questions about this necessarily, but I do think it is good as far as helping you to understand what's going to be going on over the rest of the semester. So thank you, and I will see you in lecture 1.